Hi, this is Joshua Johnson, host of the Shifting Culture podcast, and I just want to say we have a giveaway on our Instagram page. So go to Instagram at Shifting Culture Podcast, and thanks to Brazos Press, we're giving away copies of The Understory by Lori Ferguson Wilbert, Empowered to Repair by Brenda Salter McNeil, and Fully Alive by Elizabeth Oldfield. The episodes are fantastic. I hope you listen to them all. But then enter to win before May 28th, because the winner will be announced May 28th. Go to the Instagram at Shifting Culture Podcast to enter.
I was in Israel and I saw a rabbi, and I wanted to go talk to him. And so I walked up to him. I didn't know him, and introduced ourselves to each other. And he said something interesting. And so I was like, hey, I had this question when I was on the plane. You know, there's three metaphors of place in the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament: Egypt, the desert, the promised land. Like, in a person's life, how much time do you think they spend in Egypt, place of struggle, oppression, slavery? The desert, place of just wandering, uncertainty, wondering, where is God in all this? And the promised land, like the land of milk and honey. And he laughs at me. And he's like, you Americans are so funny. You think everything's up and to the right. Not for us. We think 10 to 15% of our life is in Egypt, 10 to 15% of our life is in the promised land, and the remaining 70 to 80% is in the desert. You all just try to bypass the desert at all cost. But if you actually learned, it would transform the way that you trust and see and experience the goodness of God.
Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. We long to see the body of Christ look like Jesus. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. Our show is powered by you, the listener. So if you want to support the work that we do, get early access to episodes, episode guides, and more, go to patreon.com/shiftingculture to become a monthly patron so that we can continue in this important work. And don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app to be notified when new episodes come out each week. And go leave a rating and review. It's easy. It only takes a second, and it helps us find new listeners to the show. Just go to the show page on the app that you're using right now and hit 5 stars. Thank you so much. You know what else would help us out? Share this podcast with your friends, your family, your network. Tell them how much you enjoy it, and let them know that they should be listening as well. If you are new here, welcome. If you want to dig deeper, find us on social media at Shifting Culture Podcast, where I post video clips and quotes and interact with all of you. Previous guests on the show have included Amy Bird, Sharon Hottie Miller, and Justin Davis. You can go back, listen to those episodes, and more. But today's guest is Steve Carter. Steve Carter is the best-selling author of The Thing Beneath the Thing, host of the Craft and Character podcast, a coach to communicators who are looking to find their unique voice or take their next step of growth in speaking, and teaches regularly at churches, conferences, and various businesses around the country. His book, Grieve, Breathe, and Receive, released on May 7th, and it helps guide people on their unique grief journey. He is the former lead teaching pastor at Willow Creek Community Church and currently serves as a teaching pastor at Forest City Church. He lives outside Chicago, Illinois, with his wife and 2 kids. Do you know that grief catches us all? One of the things I'm learning about the culture that I'm from is that we don't grieve well. We really don't know how to do it. In this conversation, Steve Carter shares about his experience grieving after leaving his job at Willow Creek. He talks about the process of grieving he went through, including dealing with unforgiveness, reorienting his identity, and learning to forgive. He discusses the importance of community and walking through grief with hope. He also shares about helping his son process what happened and the importance of holding space for others in their grief journey. So join us as we learn to grieve, to breathe, and to receive. Here's my conversation with Steve Carter. Steve, welcome to Shifting Culture. Excited to have you on. Thanks for joining me.
Definitely. It's such an honor to be on this podcast.
Well, hey, it's an honor to have you here. We're going to share your story a little bit and get into grief and the process of walking through that and hopefully releasing some of that and getting to receive something at the end of our grief process that never actually goes away, that we get to hold grief with us the rest of our lives, but we have some joy in the midst of it. So to start us out, I'd love to hear your story of coming to grips with things falling apart, change happening in your life, and the moment that grief started to hit you.
Yeah, I think that for much of my life, I had done what probably many of us do, and that's just avoid grief, to kind of avoid a desert season in any way, shape, or form, just to achieve, set goals, go after them. And, in many ways, try to do the most good. But I almost like Jenga was like stacking up grievances and pains and wounds from my childhood, a biological father in the picture, out of the picture. And that just creates a whole bunch of confusion around identity. Like, was it because of me that he left? And so you just keep kind of going through life. And in 2018 is probably the real invitation to have to deal with the concept of grief. In 2018, I was stepping into my dream job as the lead teaching pastor at Willow Creek Community Church in Chicago. I had been handpicked by my mentor, and myself and another person would be leading out as he was in this succession process. And then some allegations started to come out. And when those allegations start to come out, you're kind of like, wait, what? You're overwhelmed. Like, how am I supposed to think about this? And there's so many thoughts going through your mind, thoughts about the victims, thoughts about the congregation, thoughts about my mentor, thoughts about what does this mean for my life and my career. And unfortunately, I just had a different way that I thought that the leaders should have handled this tragic story of abuse. And I ended up resigning on August 5th, 2018. On a Sunday morning, I just wrote a blog and released it into the world saying, I'm stepping out. And it was hard. It was just a really, really hard season. I did not want that to be the case. I just felt like I couldn't play with a congregation's trust. And that just kind of pushed me into, what do you do when life does what it does, and when it shocks you, and when change shows up on your doorstep that you didn't see coming? And I just felt like the Lord say, go to the desert, wait for instructions. You can't achieve your way out of this. You can only grieve your way through it. And I didn't know how to grieve. And so that's what I spent the last 5 years learning. How do you grieve? And it took me back to my childhood. It took me back to some real trauma. But in the end, the desert season became one of the most redemptive and healing seasons that I've ever experienced.
It seems counterintuitive that the desert seasons are going to be the one that is going to bring you this place of, hey, I am a new creation. I'm a new person, that God has actually brought forth new things in my life, that going through this difficult, hard season. I think a lot of people right now, since the pandemic in 2020, like, we have a worldwide sense of grief and desert for a while. And so this isn't, it seems like the world was shaking, and you got the privilege of walking through it a couple years before everybody to walk through it together. So one of the things that you write about, I think, while you're looking like this is happening, you talk about perception, like perceiving yourself, perceiving the way that others look at you and view you, and knowing that a lot of the things that you're seeing about yourself is built on maybe on lies, maybe a little bit a shifting of a falsehood, but it wasn't rooted really in the truth of who God says you are, or who you are as a beloved child. how did you start to realize that your perception of yourself and what maybe even the institution or your family situation was different than you thought it was previously?
Yeah. What's interesting is you can be a preacher and pastor and study God's word and still drift 2%, 5%, 9%, 15% from your belovedness by God. And you can find your identity without even really thinking about it by what you do and not what has been done for you. You can have that happen. And then when it's taken away, I think that's when it gets more exacerbated, because people are referring to you as the former lead teaching pastor at Willow Creek. And you're like, almost like, are my best days behind me? And then people are asking you at a party, hey, what do you do? And you're like, I used to do something that seemingly had significance and people respected. Now I'm trying to figure out what I do by waking up and walking in the desert. Like it just was such a tricky piece. So that's like in one sense of your identity. But the second piece that I think I had to really, really wrestle down is I started to believe other people's perceptions about me as almost gospel. So for instance, I was told, Steve, you're not a leader. You're a great preacher. You are not a leader.
Yeah. I read that in your book. I got angry for you. Like, I was like, what are you saying here? This is ridiculous.
But you sit there and you go, I didn't put on a global leadership summit. I didn't, like, who am I? Maybe he's right. Maybe. And these certain statements started to just attach themselves to me and almost force me to start to wonder, well, maybe that's true. Maybe I'm just a teacher. Maybe I'm not this. And what's tricky is when you go through a season of betrayal, and betrayal trauma messes with you. You talk to anyone where there's been an affair, you talk to anyone where someone betrayed or violated trust, it messes with you because you don't know if your discernment got leveled or if your discernment leveled up. And that's where I started to recognize, going, wait, why did I allow someone to tell me who I am? And why was I able to believe that? What does that say about me? And I went back to an old Christine Kane talk, and I'll never forget it. I was sitting in the front row, and she was teaching on Genesis 1, 2, and 3 on the questions God asks. And she had this one moment where, she gets fiery and like just passionate, like she always does in her talks. It was just brilliant. But she's like, who told you that? Like God was asking like the man, like, who told you that? And then she started to play, did God really say? Or was that like the enemy? And I had to almost bring a bunch of phrases that I was holding on to. And I had to ask, did God really say you're not a leader? Or did someone else say that? Did God really say this? Or was that somebody else? Did God really say that? Or was that someone who was just transferring their pain onto you? But I had held it, believed it, and allowed my identity to become it. And so part of the walking in the desert and speaking with mentors and therapists was to recognize, oh man, you gave a little too much power to those people because they don't have the right to define who you are. Only God does. So that's kind of some of the stuff that really had to work through in the desert season.
What else did you have to work through in the desert season? You had to work through the shakiness of your identity, the broken identity that you thought you had, that you're saying, okay, God, what do you say about me? These other people didn't. What else did you have to walk through in your desert season of grief?
So for me, that phrase "in Christ" became really really fascinated me. I still remember like one of the first times I was just reading through the New Testament when we had moved to Arizona. So we left Chicago. We actually literally moved to the desert. My wife was from there, and I had shared with her, hey, I feel like God's telling us to go to the desert. And I'm thinking it's metaphorical. And she just teared up and said, I've been sensing the same thing. I want to go home. And so we moved to Arizona, and I just get up early, start hiking. And I'm reading through some of the chapters in the New Testament, and I come across that phrase, in Christ, and realizing like the first church really saw themselves entering into the life and the death and the burial and the resurrection of Christ. And I had just this little phrase where I was like, I want to make discipleship fun again. Like I have, there's so much hard. Let me return to when I was 18 and I realized what a Talmudim or disciple of Jesus was. Like, bring me back to that. And in that phrase, in Christ, I really saw this pattern of Holy Weekend, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Good Friday, where an innocent man dies, Silent Saturday, where the disciples have no idea what's next, and then the surprise of Easter Sunday. And that really became the framework for grieve, breathe, receive. And I started to recognize, man, I gotta grieve what I thought it was going to be. I gotta grieve how key people let me down. And I gotta grieve what it actually is, like what happened. I gotta breathe in new mercies like Lamentations 3. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They're new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I like breathe in those new mercies each morning and exhale whatever bitterness or unforgiveness or sadness or anger was within me. And I had to receive. I had to allow myself to be surprised by Easter Sunday and receive what I needed to learn, what I needed to own, who God and Christ and the Spirit wanted me to become. But I think the struggle for me really was in the amount of unforgiveness I was carrying. And part of that desert was recognizing, Willow didn't hurt me. Willow didn't mess with my faith. Willow didn't wrong me. 5 people did. And my job was to actually start to work on the process of forgiveness so that if God ever did a work in their heart and we could show up at the table and reconcile and have an honest and real conversation, I at least wanted to know that I had done my work. And I pray that a miracle might happen, but that process of unforgiveness and getting that out and learning to actually forgive, that did something in me that I'm just still thankful to God for.
It's a crucial process. It's something that you need to release that and forgive. As we train missionaries, one of the things that is crucial is we have a process, a forgiveness process, that's called Fresh Start, that walks people through, the unforgiveness that they have and then releases things and forgives. And it helps tremendously that we could go through that process. What did that process look like for you? What was the work that you had to do to get to forgiveness so that you could release and be free from the stuff that you were carrying?
Yeah. So I pretty much typically either start with my, the cognitive, the head, I want to study something, or I feel it and then I jump straight to, okay, I got to learn about it. And so I just found myself so angry. And maybe for some of you listening right now, you know exactly what that's like. Someone betrayed you, someone hurt you, and even just the thought of their name or their face, and you almost have what John Ortberg refers to as an anger fantasy. Like you envision being in a room with them and saying what you need to say. And I was having these moments. It was almost like coming out of me when I was walking on the trail or driving in the car. And, as Jim Kress, an amazing therapist, says, when you react, you're just reenacting the past. Or when you get hysterical, it's most often historical. So you got to go back to that place and start to mine it, get to it, learn about it. And so I started to identify a handful of really, really painful, traumatic moments in that Willow season and the people that were behind it. I named the person, not the institution. I named the person, one of those 5. I named what they did. And so I just held that. But the second thing I started to do is I looked at the 2 Greek words that are used for forgiveness. And the first one is aphemi. It's in the Lord's Prayer, forgive us our debts as we forgive those who are indebted to us. And that comes from the Day of Atonement or Yom Kippur. And aphemi literally means to release and send away. And then the second Greek word for forgiveness is the word charismai, and we get the word grace, charis, in there. And then the zomai literally is the grace I've received, I freely give away. So it takes you to the foot of the cross. And so I started to have this little breath prayer, and I would carry these little brown crosses in my pocket. And anytime one of those 5 names came to the forefront, I simply would just return to the cross. The grace I received, can I give away? Like I wronged Christ. I've wronged people. I want grace. Can I still extend it to them? And can I release it? And can I send it away? And so this simple little breath prayer, cross, release, send it away. And I would pray that, I'd say the first time I started it for 2 people in particular, it was north of 100 times a day. And slowly but surely, it started to get to 75 times a day and 40 times a day. And now, every once in a while, there might be a flare up on Twitter or something happens that triggers a memory. But I just simply go cross, release, send it away. And it's a way for me to say, I don't want this in me. Because here's the thing, Joshua. Unforgiveness is a seed. And that seed will find soil in your heart. And it will grow and it will produce a fruit of bitterness, anger, rage, gossip, slander. It's all in Ephesians chapter 4. You see it. But when you choose to forgive, and you think about John chapter 20, Jesus returns and all the disciples are like, what? This guy just walked through a wall and he's like, hey, peace be with you. He says it again, peace be with you. Then he breathes on them resurrection breath. And then he says, receive the Spirit. And then he says like the most common sense line ever. He goes, the people you choose to forgive will be forgiven, and those that you don't won't be. It's like, it's up to you. Will you choose to keep this in your system because you don't have the vision of the kingdom of God? Or will you see a more profound vision that you were supposed to walk lightly and freely? And watch how Jesus did it. He just cross, release, send it away. Cross, release, send it away. So that just did a work in me. And I often will say this, forgiveness is a solo sport. Reconciliation takes more people, but we got to do that solo sport well to prepare us for the day we can sit across the table with the people who have harmed us, if that is safe and okay to do.
Yeah, I know that I need to do that as a solo sport, but I need others sometimes to help me get to that place.
Yes.
Like my unforgiveness that I've been holding, sometimes my spiritual director will help, and it just comes out in those sessions, right? And then he's like, okay, is there anybody you need to forgive? Is it God? Is it yourself? Is it someone else? And we walk through that process. A debrief happened last year, and I was able to walk through stages of the last 5 years and say, oh, I do need to forgive this and this. And so it helped. What is that process then with community to help us get to the place of realizing that there is some unforgiveness, that we have to start to do that work ourselves?
Great question. Yeah, I really think everyone's life would be a lot healthier if they had a therapist that they trust and they gave permission to, a spiritual director that they trust and were able to give permission to, a mentor, and community. I think you have, because each of them see a different side of you. Some are on the payroll, some are not, some that you are paying, and some that are just friends, but they all have a different vantage point. So for me, it was, I would say definitely those 4 were really, really helpful. Add in my spouse, obviously. But I would say one thing I learned, and this came from a counselor friend, I was just sharing with him a little bit about what was these anger fantasies. And he said, you know what's amazing? 75 to 80% of my clients who come in and sit with me don't know how to forgive. And then he said, if you actually in the church taught people how to forgive, I'd probably be out of a job. And he's like, it's kind of ironic that you don't, and it wasn't like he wasn't throwing shame or shade. He was like, just like genuinely saying this, can communicate forgiveness so well, but it's still really, really hard to actually put into practice. And I had a really hard time forgiving myself. It's easier for me to want a bright side and forgive others. It was hard for me to forgive myself. And I think learning and being able to give permission to people that were safe to ask the harder question just created new invitations for me to have to bring before the Lord, or a mentor or a therapist or a friend or a spouse. And I think for me right now, I think so many of us are living in isolation. I was talking to a friend. I don't know, Joshua, I'd love to get your thoughts on this actually, because I realized when I came up in ministry, I really worked hard to have mentors in my life, but I didn't work at the same earnestness for mentors that I did for close friends. Because I thought, these people are going to have like the keys to life. But I think as you get older, you recognize, hey, if you cheat on like community, or you cheat on mentors, or you cheat on doing the internal work, or you cheat, like it's gonna affect your ability to have almost a 360 view of what it is that maybe the Lord's inviting you for your next best right step. And so I think I came to realize, like in my 30s, man, I'm gonna need some stronger community. And thanks be to God, because a lot of those are the people that were able to, who knew me before Willow, who knew the struggles I had, knew me, that I think were able to reflect back, hey, I think this is something you gotta start processing through. And the question is, do you have the courage to do it?
Yeah. We need those close friends. Like it is absolutely necessary. I mean, that's one of the last things I was talking to my spiritual director about, is I feel like I don't have enough of those close friends anymore. Like I'm somebody, I only need like 1, 2, 3, like good close friends. And I've realized that some of those friends are seasonal friends. Like they're here for a season. And so I'm trying to re-up at the moment. And it's also takes courage to say, I'm going to put myself out there and try to go and find people that I could go deep with and be genuine and be a friend. It's not easy. It's hard. But I know that when I have it, I feel like I'm firm in my foundation. Like I can go and weather storms because I have those people with me. And if I didn't have those, then the storms would almost, cripple me. And so I needed it.
Yeah, that's so good. That's so good. I think of like Acts 16, when Paul and Silas find themselves in prison and they start singing while other people listen. And I think it's so much easier to sing or have that resiliency, like you said, to face the storm when you have a couple people beside you. And sometimes there's only one person beside you. But when you're alone and the voices inside, the voices outside, trying to be able to see true north, it's so much harder, so much harder.
So, my mother-in-law passed away at the end of January, and she lived with us for 7 years, really. And my wife took care of her at the end while she was going through things. And it was just a long process. One of the things my wife said, Meredith said, after maybe a month after her mom died, is, I don't know who I am anymore. And that's the process of grief, right? Is when you're in that grief spot, you're just like, who am I? And it feels like there's a reorientation. So that feels to me like a Saturday. It feels like the silence of Holy Week. Like, I don't know who I am. I'm disillusioned. There's something, there's a death that happened, whatever it is, or a change that happened. Now I'm sitting here. I don't know who I am. What is this breathing aspect of this process that you have in this Saturday when you're disillusioned? And what are you breathing? What is it?
Yeah, it's so good. What's really tricky is for many of us who are structured, we, whether we were taking care of our mother-in-law, like Meredith, your wife, or for me, if you asked me what time of the day and day of the week, I could tell you what I was doing at Willow. I was very structured. Well, all of a sudden, when that gets removed, now you're like, what do I do with my time? So it affects like what those disciples, they were like, we walked with Jesus. We saw miracles. We were with that rabbi. Like we were doing good. Now we're fishing or hiding or wondering, like, what do we do now? And I think that will take us in so many different directions. Sometimes for some of us, it takes us to anger, like it's because of them. They did this. Or it's frustration towards God. Why did you take my mom? Why this? It's frustration towards a spouse. It's a sense of uncertainty. And so for me, in those Saturday moments, you almost have to Jedi mind trick yourself a little bit, because in the desert, and you know this, when the Hebrew people had gotten out of Egypt, they were pretty close to the promised land, but it still took them 40 years. And one scholar says it's because it's one thing to leave Egypt, it's another thing to have Egypt leave you. And I think that for many people in that liminality, that liminal space, we don't know how to wait well. And so for me, I hate the wait. I please don't make me wait for my Starbucks. Like, please don't make, like, I want to live the most efficient life possible. And then for some of us, we waste the wait. Like we find ourselves in this liminal space between Friday and Sunday, and we don't know how to press in. We just know how to escape, and we just choose some unhealthy escapes. And I understand it. I'm not shaming anyone in that, but I even was surprised. Temptations that I thought I had been overcame, and they came back, because now I realize, like, oh, I don't have structure. I have all this time. Well, I was just busy that I didn't have the time to even entertain this. Now I do. And so it was very quick and easy to choose an unhealthy escape. And so for some of us, we hate the wait. Some of us, we waste the wait. I think it's the conscious decision to say, Lord, help me win the wait, and let me just trust you. Whatever that Egypt is within me, do whatever it takes to get that out of my system. And I'll tell you this. I was in Israel, and I saw a rabbi, and I wanted to go talk to him. And so I walked up to him. I didn't know him, and introduced ourselves to each other. And he said something interesting. And so I was like, hey, I had this question when I was on the plane. There's 3 metaphors of place in the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament: Egypt, the desert, the promised land. Like, in a person's life, how much time do you think they spend in Egypt, place of struggle, oppression, slavery? The desert, place of just wandering, uncertainty, wondering, where is God in all this? And the promised land, like the land of milk and honey. And he laughs at me, and he's like, you Americans are so funny. You think everything's up and to the right. Not for us. We think 10 to 15% of our life is in Egypt. 10 to 15% of our life is in the promised land. And the remaining 70 to 80% is in the desert. You all just try to bypass the desert at all cost. But if you actually learned, it would transform the way that you trust and see and experience the goodness of God. I did not know what that guy meant when he said that to me in 2014. But come 2018, that statement was like, oh my goodness, I've spent my life bypassing the desert. bypassing the sadness, bypassing the pain, wasting the weight, hating the weight. And now the question is, will I trust and experience a really deeper, kinder, more gentler and good God, even when life isn't up and to the right, even in the uncertainty and the unknown?
Yeah, we're always just becoming, right?
That's right.
We never get to arrive up and to the right. It's not. We're never there.
Yeah.
Even in the promised land area, we're still becoming, and we're still growing. We're still moving towards Christ.
Yeah. Isn't it Ruth Bell Graham? Her tombstone says her name, the date she was born, date she dies, and then underneath it says, "End of construction. Thanks for your patience." On her tombstone, which is just
awesome.
Amazing to me. So
I love that. That's really good. Sometimes when we're in that waiting place, you're in desert. So in the 70% of our life in the desert, this will be fun. We open ourselves up and we say, okay, I feel like I've given everything up away. Like I'm not holding anything else. It's just you, Jesus. But then there's still the waiting. Is there resurrection life? Is Sunday really coming? Like we're here in the desert. Is Sunday coming? Is there resurrection? Is there a gift? Do we get a gift going through this process? What is there and it's not the end because, right, we're still under construction, but is there any good gifts that God gives in the midst of it?
So for me, I think one of the ways formation can work in discipleship is through like a little simple struggle, sacred process, meaning we love simple truths. God is with me. God is for me. God will never leave me nor forsake me. That's a very simple truth. But then you go through the desert, the struggle, the suffering, you get punched in the gut. And now you have to go, is God with me? Is God for me? Will God never leave me nor forsake me when I don't have a stage or a congregation or this or that? Like, will he? And that's what the desert really, really showed me as I was walking, and there's no concrete. It's like coyotes and rattlesnakes. It's barren. And then every once in a while you'd start to see something bloom. And it just reminded me of the way that the Lord all throughout Scripture would surprise you. And I felt like the disciples were surprised. They didn't see Sunday coming. And most people, when they die, they don't get back up. And that changed everything. And so I just started having this little prayer, Lord, surprise me today. Lord, surprise me today. Would you surprise me today? Let me see Sunday today. Surprise me today. And what was amazing is when that simple truth, God is with you, God is for you, God will never leave you nor forsake you, actually can go through the struggle and it still holds up. That statement isn't simple anymore. It is weighty and sacred because he is with me. It was never about how good of a sermon I preached. It was never about how big of a congregation I had. That wasn't what made him want to be with me and for me. He was with me even when nobody was watching. He was for me even at my lowest moment. And so all of a sudden now, it's like I hear these phrases that I would nod my head in agreement. Now it's like I put both hands over my heart and inhale and exhale and say, thanks be to God. And so for me, that is, how do you stay open to the surprise? How do you stay open? And 1 Thessalonians 4 is, you have to grieve. You got to grieve with hope. That's what's different about us in our faith is we know that Sunday happened and that he's returning again. We have hope. And how do we hold both and not just choose one or just choose the other, but how do you hold both and hold them well?
Can you define hope for us? I know in America, we don't really know what hope is. We just use it.
Yeah.
What's a deeper hope for us? What is hope?
So hope for me is, I think, one of the most profound and stunning and beautiful words and concepts In the Roman culture, they didn't teach hope. They actually mocked you if you were a person of hope, because all they wanted was you to live in reality. And if it could not be defined, they thought it was weak. And so when Paul writes in Romans 5, talking about suffering and perseverance, character, and character, hope, and hope will not be put to shame, that would have been so revolutionary for that church in Rome. Like, we are people of hope. So it's fascinating, though, is the way that we talk about hope is in this like whimsy, far from what the text meant with hope. It's like, I hope the University of Michigan wins the national championship again next year in football. Like, I hope there's no traffic on my way to the airport. But that's all preaching uncertainty. I don't really know. So what is hope? And for me, I use this acronym because I try to dare people to hope. I had to dare myself to hope. And the D is you desire something good. For this situation, I desire reconciliation. I desire healing. And when you desire something good, it's desiring heaven to enter into that situation and the values of heaven and the way of Christ to do something in that moment. So I desire that. I try to, the way Paul writes it is fix our eyes on the heavenly things, have the same mindset as Christ. What would Christ's mindset be for this situation? Have that level of desire and hope. Second is anything is possible. As Joby Martin, pastor in Jacksonville, Church of 1122 says, if the tomb is empty, anything is possible. So what's harder, fixing this relationship that's broken or raising a man from the dead? I think raising a man is probably harder. So I think that anything is possible, including this, because that's at the heartbeat of God: restoration, renewal, reconciliation. And why can I say that? Because resurrection brings certainty. And when I actually believe we're people of the resurrection, or as Barbara Johnson says, we are Easter people living in a Good Friday world. And so my definition of hope is when I can desire something good, believe anything is possible, resurrection brings certainty, and I can expect and anticipate that good is on its way. For me, that's what hope is. It is the expectation and anticipation, because of the resurrection and because of the heart of God, that his goodness and his redemption and his restoration is on its way. And sometimes it doesn't go as fast as I like it to go, but I gotta keep my eyes open, my ears open, my heart open, because he's in the business of surprising us again and again and again.
Amen. That's so good. I think that's really helpful for us to figure out, what does it look like to hold on to hope? And so we're walking through these situations. That's so helpful. Thank you for that. One of the things that, for me, I have a question of you going through what you did at Willow. It was very painful. It was hard. You were trying to live in an integral space and have integrity through the situation. And, at that same time, you were having conversations with your son about integrity. And he was asking if you lived with integrity during that day. And your son said something at the coffee shop in your book that I think was important. And if I get it wrong, you could correct me. But, as he's talking about, hey, I thought that you said if you did things right, then things will go well for you. And people at the coffee shop were yelling at you. You had somebody yelling at you. It just looked like somebody didn't like you at that time when you stood up and you did something right. How do we walk our children through this process when painful things are happening to us and they are seeing it and viewing it? And so how do you walk alongside of them?
Yeah. That's probably where so much of my unforgiveness came, because I was really, really worried and fearful of what that trauma would do for my kids and their faith and their life and their heart, their mind, their body, their soul. So I was at a local coffee shop, and someone who went to Willow saw me, and I was grabbing the drink for my son and me. And he was fifth grade at the time, and we were walking, about to turn and walk out, and this woman just came up and just, "You're a coward. You abandoned us. You're not a leader." And just in front of my son's holding my hand, looking at me, looking at her, looking at me, looking at her. And I just, brought him close, and she went for about 45 seconds. And I just said, as the people in the coffee shop are looking, and I just looked back at her and I just said, I appreciate you trusting me with your full feelings about me, and walked to the car, and I could feel the anger coming. I was so frustrated, like just the cortisol rushing through my body. And I'm putting my son in the back seat of the car, and he just looks at me before he like enters in. He's like, "Hey, you always told me that if you did the right thing, you'd be rewarded. So you either lied to me because that didn't feel like a reward, or you didn't do the right thing." And Joshua, I didn't know what to say, but thanks be to God, God gave me like just this little word in that moment. I just said, "But I don't know what to really say to you outside of when Mom was pregnant with your sister, whose name is Mercy. She threw up 2 times a day, and it was a hard pregnancy. But on May 22nd, when Mom and I held Mercy for the first time, she wasn't thinking about the vomiting and the throwing up. She was just, it was all worth it. And I don't know when we're going to hold our version of Mercy, but I am choosing to believe that day will come." And that's all I could remind my son of. I couldn't tell him when. I couldn't tell him how. I just had to almost embody that hope and that biblical understanding of it. And then second, hold space for him to feel. And I mean, when we moved to Arizona, it was a really dark time for him, to be honest, because, and then COVID happens. He can't go to school. It's just all and all of his friends were back here. And so it just sitting and then he's asking more questions. Why did that affect us? Why did that happen? And you're having to sit present to him, not get triggered yourself, but then go on a walk and let that come out, cross-release, send it away, process it with, your spiritual mentors and pastors and friends. But you just had to give him space to feel it. And I will say this, at the end, we've always tried to teach our kids the power of agency, to be able to name their desires. Doesn't mean it's always going to come, but we wanted them to be attuned to that. And as he was moving into his freshman year, we asked him, "Where would you like to go to high school? Do you want to stay in Arizona? Do you want to?" And without missing a beat, he said, "I want to go home." And I said, "Where's home?" And he said, "Our old neighborhood." And Joshua, we did the craziest thing. We moved 20 doors down from where we used to live. And I don't know very many people who move back to their personal Chernobyl, but I will tell you, he felt heard. And recently he told me, he said, "Hey, thanks for listening to what I needed. I know this is probably harder and maybe not what you would have chosen, but this feels like the right move for me." And he's a sophomore in high school. He's just awesome. But I think in that moment, he wasn't saying this, but I went back to that coffee shop parking lot and I was like, just with tears in my eye, he's holding his version of Mercy. Thanks be to God.
That's beautiful. Such a beautiful story. Thank God that he's holding his version of Mercy at the moment. That's right. That is so good. So good. If you could tell your readers one thing you hope that they would get from this book, what would you hope your readers would get?
I hope that you will see the text, see Holy Weekend, see your story, your pain, and realize you're not alone. This isn't a book that's going to tell you all the answers, 7 steps to this, and that. It's one that I believe you will be able to find yourself in. and invite some deeper conversations with the Lord, with the Spirit, with a friend, a mentor, therapist, pastor, spiritual director. Because I think that the grief journey, maybe a better way to say it is, you can't get to Sunday if you don't experience Friday and Saturday. And I want Sunday for every single one of you. And to do that and do that well, we have to, my definition of grief is honor what comes up when change shows up, and fully honor the Friday and fully honor the Saturday, and make room for the surprise of Sunday.
So good. Steve, a couple questions at the end. One, if you go back to your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give?
You're going to be okay. You're going to be okay. You keep doing your internal work. Keep getting after the thing beneath the thing. Keep doing your work on your story. And then secondly is, it doesn't matter where you're at and how big of an opportunity you have. God still feels the same about you, no matter what. No matter what you do or what you did, he still feels absolutely, fully, madly, recklessly in love with who you are becoming.
Anything you've been reading, watching lately you could recommend?
Oh, great question. Let me look. Man, I've been reading a bunch of books. You know, when you write a book, you don't read outside of, like, because you just don't want like other thoughts getting through, and so you maybe do research, but then you get into writing, you're just writing, and then when you get done with the edited manuscript, you're like, I can return to my third love. You know, first love the Lord, second love Michigan football, third love reading, and like I can just return to it. So, I just read The Hidden Peace by Joel Muddamalle, Darren Whitehead's The Digital Fast. I'm working my way through Allison Cook's new book, which is unbelievable. And then Stronger Like Water by Andi Kohler. She has a guided journal that I've been working through. And then my buddy Luke Norsworthy just wrote a book it's such a good title, How to Love the Life You Already Have. And I just finished that book 2 days ago, and it was remarkable. So yeah, those are some of the stuff I've been reading.
Awesome. Those are great. How can people go out and get your book, Grieve, Breathe, Receive, and then connect with you? Where would you like to point people to?
You can find me at stevecarter.org or online, Instagram, Twitter, or X, or whatever we call it, at Steve Ryan Carter. So we'd love to connect, reach out, help in any way.
Great. Well, Steve, thank you for this conversation. It was fantastic. I loved walking through your story, and thank you for sharing that with us. Thank you for opening yourself up and taking us through your grieving process so that we can feel like we aren't alone, like we can do it as well, that we can go through Friday and go through Saturday so that we could get to the hope of Sunday, that there is resurrection coming. But the grief process is something that we have to go through, that we have to go through the desert. And thank you for sharing the story with your son as well. I think that was very, very moving to me and helpful, and figuring out, how do we hold on to hope? How do we dare to hold on to hope? So thank you, Steve, for this conversation. It was fantastic.
Thank you, Joshua. And seriously, I have some holy envy over the guests that you've had on the Shifting Culture podcast. And so just to be on this podcast, man, it really, really, truly means the world. So you're doing great work. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. You too. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you want to see more episodes like this, go to patreon.com/shiftingculture and become a monthly patron of the show. You can help us produce more episodes so that we can see the body of Christ look more like Jesus. If you become a patron on patreon.com/shiftingculture, you will get early access to episodes. You will get episode guides. You will get bonus shows, hopefully, and more. So go to patreon.com/shiftingculture and become a monthly patron. Also, leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps us out and helps us find new listeners to the show. And just go and share this podcast with your friends, your family, your network, people that you think would enjoy it as well. Thank you again for listening to the show. I hope you have a great week.